Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to today's Partner Web Conference. This is Lessons from the Field, How to Use Analytics to Drive Adoption. My name is Janice and I'm going to be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this web conference through Skype meeting broadcast and the audio can be heard through your PC speakers only. Today's web conference is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. If you do not consent to be a part of a recorded session, we ask that you please disconnect your browser at this time. The web conference recording will be available within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenter or need support, you can use the Q&A panel located either on the right-hand side of your screen or by scrolling down to just under the video player. We do have presenters standing by to answer your questions throughout the session. Now a little bit more about this presentation. This web conference has been brought to you in partnership across the Office 365, Windows, and EMS teams to cover topics on Microsoft 365 products and solutions. This webcast will be 45 to 50 minutes in length, and a presenter will then switch over to Q&A and start addressing any unanswered questions. We'd like to thank you in advance for your patience while he works through those. If you find your question was not answered or would like more follow-up, you can also head over to the Office 365 Partners Yammer group and post your question there. We'll be sharing out that Yammer link in just a couple moments. Now, on to the presentation. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Customer Success Manager, Chris Slimp. So without further delay, Chris, over to you.
All right, thank you very much. And so for someone who doesn't understand or hasn't heard about a customer success manager role at Microsoft, some of them are relatively new. We've had some in some areas and not in others. But my job is really to help our customers get more business value from what they already own. So it's not a sales role, it's not a technical support role, it's really focused on the business and trying to get the most out of it. And from that angle, you may make sense as to why I care so much about driving adoption and the methods that I'll be talking with you about today. So whether or not you currently subscribe to Microsoft 365 for your business, I hope what I can do here today is inspire you to use data in making yourself, your team, or your company much more productive. And I'm sensitive to the fact we have probably both a mix of customers and partners here, so I'll try to speak to both of you, but that's the goals for today. So now if you're watching this webinar, you probably care about driving adoption, or you wouldn't have signed up. It was all about driving adoption. But if you're here, you may need to explain the importance of adoption to others. People kind of get it inherently, but I thought I'd share this visual because it helps me to really drive home that message. So what you see here is that when we start a project, we are trying to deploy it first and get it activated. Obviously, foundational, absolutely critical to everything that goes after it. So I don't want to minimize this. It's really important. However, the value, the actual business value, is derived when your users are actually using the software and becoming proficient at it. And so, whereas many times that deployment and activation phase is often thought of as the project, it's the project of activating the software and getting it rolling. And it's kind of an IT perspective. And what we're trying to do more at Microsoft and with all of our customers is to see the entire thing as the project, really, that we're not done. We're really only at base camp when we get this thing turned on, right? The rest of the journey is getting the value, getting the intended business value out of it. And Microsoft is increasingly wanting to be part of that journey of getting value and helping our customers along with that. So what is it that we're actually driving adoption of exactly? We're focused today on Microsoft 365. It could be any number of things, but Microsoft 365 it really is more than the sum of its parts. Here are some of the main parts of it. There are these experiences that the users see across the middle, each of them designed for the unique needs of different types of collaboration. And there are, of course, some infrastructure pieces at the bottom there that are really key differentiators for Microsoft's solution here, I think. But when we're talking about driving adoption, it's really about more than just any one of those tools. It's a way of working. It's actually a shift in culture in many cases that's just as much or more profound than the change of using a different tool. So we have to keep that in mind as we go through all of what's to follow here in the presentation, that while we will be looking at how to measure adoption of a specific tool, or usage analytics that we can look at for different tools, it's in a much bigger context, and I'm hoping that will be become abundantly clear as we get through this. So regardless of what tools we provide, in most cases employees still have a choice to keep working the way that they always have. They can always fall back to sending emails, going to meetings, and putting up posters or sending carrier pigeons or whatever they were doing before. We have to inspire a new way of working in most cases, and that is not usually, employees are usually not inspired by many of the methods that we often see used, which are like a policy or procedural mandate. An email blast, like I get hundreds of emails a day. Why is your email telling me that I should use this new tool any more important than the next 15 that I have to deal with today? Or there's that good old standby training, right? I get pulled into a training session and told to use a tool or explain how to use it, and we do those things over and over again and expect a different result. We really have to think about how we inspire new ways of working. So how do we do that? Well, as human beings, we are hardwired to listen to and be motivated by stories. It's been millennia, right? It's the way that we learn how to succeed and how to fail, whether that was the hunt for food, for love, for power, whatever it is. We seek out, listen to, and are motivated by stories. It's part of who we are. So let me set a benchmark for what I mean by storytelling. So this is one of my all-time favorite ads. I'm not even a whiskey drinker, but this is, maybe it's the setting of my new home in Scotland, actually. After this webinar, I want you to search for Johnny Walker, Two Brothers, and watch this video. It is a fantastic ad. I won't ruin it, but suffice to say, it does leave a strong impression and an emotional impact. This is a story about the human impact of their product. It's not even about the product itself. So what I want you to do here, though, is ask yourself, what if the stories that we told about the way that we've transformed our everyday work lives, the place that we spend the vast majority of our time on this planet, in our workday lives, what if those stories that we told about the way we transform that were this impactful, right? Actually meant something to us because of the impact that we could have, because of the connection that we found with other people. Here's another great example. This one's actually from Microsoft. It tells the story of two girls who became friends from across the world because of a shared disability. And they eventually, towards the end, as you can see, meet up in person. And as they do, you can feel the human impact that a simple technology can have. In this case, it's Skype, which barely makes an appearance in the ad, by the way. So go watch that one as well when we're done. And you can see what I mean by telling a story. Now, are all of the stories that we're going to be able to tell about, adoption of SharePoint going to be this emotionally impactful? Probably not. But this is the kind of bar that I think we need to shoot for. And so if those stories, if that kind of a story is the goal, how do you find them? If we want to find where the tools that we've invested in are really changing people's lives, and making an impact on the business, how do we find them? So there is the rumor mill, there's the water cooler. That's not exactly reliable in many cases. I mean, it might be a good source to start digging, but usage analytics, the case I'm making today, is that the analytics that we have available, if they are carefully crafted and considered, it is a potential gold mine of stories. And it's not just numbers to throw on a slide for the CIO, to show that this cloud stuff that we purchased is getting used. They can also be used to further enrich the stories that we then find. So in other words, we can find stories through them. We can publish those stories, discover, enrich them, and publish them out. That drives more adoption as people see the impact that it's having in their coworkers' lives. And then that increased adoption drives more analysis to find out how else, what other stories that we can find. So before I jump into kind of some of the nitty-gritty of how we do that, let me give you an example of a real story. Again, not quite the emotional impact of the ads, but it does have promise. So there's this large division of a company that had some goals around helping their employees feel more informed, connected, and heard. And they were largely just using email, but they felt like they needed to take a look at expanding their channels and reaching people in new ways, because what they were doing wasn't necessarily working. So what we helped them to do was to set up a SharePoint site, which they weren't using before, a Yammer group, which they were not using before, and to experiment with some video streaming as well. And at the same time, we set up this dashboard. So I'll expand that a little bit here. And the data told us many things, but most importantly, two big things that we got out of it. One, we learned that the organization was actually ready to adopt these new platforms. So we saw the click-throughs on the emails, but we saw that turn into traffic on the SharePoint sites. We saw those views turn into conversations on Yammer, and we could see that funnel developing. So, and them taking up these new platforms was not a foregone conclusion. We did not know what they were going to do. So we learned that they were ready to adopt it, first of all. But more importantly, we could see which content was actually getting people reading and which content got them talking, more importantly, and connecting. And so we saw patterns in that we wanted to learn more about. So we started interviewing some employees, and it didn't take too many interviews to find that the content that we were providing needed to make a shift. It needed to be more about them. It needed to be more about the inside story. Those were the kinds of articles that were really landing and connecting, and that they couldn't, stuff they couldn't read about already out on the web. So we found a way to create a story of how we have impact. And it was more about the content plan than it was about how it got to them. So the platforms actually just faded into the background, and we could have a more important conversation about the content. If you think about it, I mean, this is the kind of thing that a marketing team, right, externally, customer facing, does all the time. We just haven't applied those principles as rigorously to our internal communications as we do for our external. So, a big takeaway from this presentation, I hope, is that those same principles that are out there that are proven can be applied internally. We actually have the data, and we have some of the ability to do that now. Okay, so where do I get the data? So what I'm going to do is go through 4 levels of analysis that you can do with the data in Office 365. So I'll talk about them from the simple to the more complex levels of data. So I'll start with statistics that are available to all of your users. These are user-facing reports that any user of the system can see. So 2 examples. One is in SharePoint. For example, you have a link in the site contents page of any SharePoint site. You'll see a link to the site usage report. And that's what that shows is a trend of views over time, a list of the most viewed content on the site, as well as content that's being shared with external guests. So this data helps a site owner to learn what content is valuable and how many are accessing it. Not to the level of detail in the report that I showed you earlier. That was enabled by a partner solution, but it does give you a good overview. And I'll show you some examples in a second. In a Yammer group, there in the right column, there's a link to what's called Group Insights. That is a set of charts that tracks activity by users that have joined the group and those that haven't, the amount of contributions. An important data point in these reports is the number of readers, because it's often many times the number of posters in the group, of course. So it's another useful measure of value. Sometimes reach is, the reach of these conversations is just as important as the contributions. Finally, there's a recent addition to every post on Yammer, which is the count of those that have read an individual post. So this woman, for example, posted in our own CEO connection group at Microsoft, and you can see her mentioning there a couple of our executives. She's calling them out and asking them to chime in on a recent public announcement. The fact that she now knows when she comes back and looks at that post that 734 colleagues saw that post, that encourages her to post again, because she knows that she'll be heard by a pretty good sized audience, right? So even at that level of analysis, you can derive some pretty great insights. So I'm going to walk you through a few examples to show you what I mean. And the point of doing this is to show you that they're not just numbers. They can have stories behind them that help you to understand how to drive better adoption. So the first examples are groups and sites that are scoped based on a role or an organization, right? So the first one is an executive connection group, like the one I was mentioning earlier. So this is a Yammer group that's used by a CEO to connect to all of their employees. And the headline here is this massive reach that they're getting. Okay, so 19,000 people have joined the group. That's the membership number. But you can see in, above the donut here, it might be a little small for you to see, but it's over 35,000 people that have been active on this group in the last year. So they're covering twice as many people as they have membership. So you'll notice though that members are much more likely to contribute. So if you're a member, you're much more likely to post or like or even read things, of course. So the suggestion to the owners of this group would be to demonstrate the value of being a member. Why would you want to actually join this group? What does that buy you? What does that give you? And maybe they aren't really offering any differentiation right now, and you should think about that, right? So this is the SharePoint site usage report, a corporate homepage in this case, massive amount of traffic, with an expected trend of a little less traffic on Fridays, right? So the obvious basic conclusion here is don't post your big news on a Friday. That's not rocket science probably, but this one, however, is a regional homepage. Much lower numbers, of course, but still upwards of 90% of the team are visiting in a given month. So what's interesting here, though, is that by far the most viewed content on the site is this page down here at the bottom. You can see org.aspx. So that's a page that's showing the structure of their organization. So there's lots of other content on this site. So it's not like there's nothing else there to see. So what does that say about this organization? If they just went through a reorg, then that would be understandable. Everybody's coming up to see who they report to. But if not, perhaps there's a little too much emphasis here in this group on hierarchical politics. And maybe that needs to be addressed. So certainly something that could be asked in a follow-up survey or interviews of the employees. So next you'll see a very different profile as we look at some communities of practice, right? So here is a group that talks about how to innovate in improving the company's products. So what you'll notice is that they have this intensely active core of members, but there's a very broad readership of it. So there's a lot of people lurking and watching what they're talking about. Compared to the executive group, there's actually more posts here, but only a third of the traffic that they get. So this is an incredibly vibrant, thriving little community. The context here is that this community actually does more than talk. They get together during hackathons and build some of the innovations that they talk about here. So this is a thriving, productive community, and it needs more visibility. It probably just needs some publicity and to do more to encourage contributions from those people, those many people here who are just lurking and watching. How much more could they get from the synergies that happen in this group? Okay, in this example, we've got a massively open online course. It's a MOOC, if you've heard that term before. And what they're doing is using Yammer for a discussion forum. Surprisingly, this is a class in which users actually formally enroll in the class, but it's getting a good share of its activity from people who haven't joined, right? Who aren't part of the course. That's great. I mean, it's scaling out the impact of the training program, but it's a little bit of a worry that contributions overall are actually pretty low, even from those people who were involved. So there's something about the course design here that should encourage more interaction. And the last example in this here is, again, a SharePoint site that is part of a community. So this is set up as a community site. And it looks like what's happened here is that basically everyone comes to the site to look at a slide deck for a community meeting, and that's it. That's all they're doing with this site. Now, if that's all that this, I don't know what the nature of this community is, but if this is going to be a thriving community, they need to have a common purpose and they need to build something together. And this site is kind of giving us the data that shows that that's the case. Okay, and speaking of a shared purpose, so there are other groups that have a clear charter to support an initiative or a program. And so let's look at a few of those, okay? So here we've got a classic example of a Yammer group where joining the Yammer group just doesn't matter. This is an IT help desk. It's a very different profile from a numbers standpoint, but it's still a big success because this IT organization, what they're doing is receiving support requests here. There's no reason for me to join. I get an answer to my question and I move on. And you can see that from, the fact that half of these red messages in the bottom center there are from non-members, people who haven't joined the group. They're just posting their problem. They track it as part of their support ticket, have a conversation with the IT help desk, and then they drop off the thread, right? So the other interesting thing here is that activity is trending down, and in some cases you might say, most cases you'd probably say activity trending down is a bad thing. Well, given the context that this is a support group, downward trend might be a good thing, right? Less support tickets. So as long as people are getting answers to their questions, the group's goals are kind of achieved. Okay, this is a travel group. The story here is that basically there's an opportunity because the readership is very high, 40, 50,000 reads per month, but there's no conversation going on here. So if they want more interaction, is a business goal for them, then they have some work to do there. Okay. So those kind of insights are really just scratching the surface. So let's get a little level deeper. I mean, I think there's some interesting things that can be found there, but if we go a little deeper, we can find some more. So the Admin Center in Office 365 provides some reports that are available to admins, but can be opened up to others. There's a report role, a report reader admin role that can be granted to anyone. That doesn't then open them up to having admin rights to the whole service. They're just just those people who may be responsible for driving adoption or fostering these communities. And so you want to give them the data without giving them access to all the knobs and dials in Office 365. So these reports can answer some similar kinds of questions, in some cases a bit deeper than the user-facing reports that we were looking at. But the goal here around these reports is really a view at the company-wide level, so to see trends across the whole company. So let me show you a few examples here. Okay, so the top level usage report. If you're not an Office 365 admin, you won't have had access to these unless they knew about that report reader role and gave it to you. So you may be seeing these for the first time. But basically what you're seeing is whether a service is really taking off or is dropping in usage over time. So you can also see whether Skype, for example, in the bottom right, in this example, it's being primarily used for peer-to-peer ad hoc chat, and not for scheduled meetings so much. So, is that an opportunity to reach out to the company as a whole and say, hey, did you know that we have this web conferencing tool that allows you to have meetings online? So you can drill down to get a little more detail at each service level. One of those, here's an example of SharePoint. SharePoint site usage report shows how many sites and files are used over time, includes page views. And what you can see here is which sites are being heavily used, right? And so you can put their owners in touch with the owners of sites that are struggling so that they can share between them what's working and what's not. How is it that you're getting all this usership within your group? Okay, this is a full list of the admin reports. Obviously not going to read them all. The thing to note here is that there's been an addition recently of Microsoft Teams, so you can get data on how Teams is being used, both by users and on what devices. And as with all of these things, more of these kinds of reports will be added. Okay. So I wanted to share a quick story about this level of analysis because it still feels a little bit high level, right? So yes, there is such a thing as a fast-moving bank. And to make a point, I want to share the story to make a point that these broad high-level numbers do play an important role, especially at the early stages of maturity. So it is important right after relaunch to know that your employees are actually using the services at all, and perhaps in the ways that you intended. This bank is moving very fast, and they are investing in managing this massive change. So it was really gratifying to see that their employees were embracing these tools at a critical mass and very quickly. However, there's only so many jelly beans you can count in the jar, right? The jar is only so big. There's a cap on how high that adoption percentage is going to go. So it's fantastic that they've done the work to get everybody on board. But now the leadership that I'm working with is already moving past the question, is it being used? We need to get to deeper questions about business value, okay? So how do we do that? The adoption content pack is one step in the right direction. This is a free set of data and dashboards that are available to Office 365 admins. This is a bit more robust and allows you to go one step deeper in your analysis. As with the admin reports, this can be opened up to the reports reader admin role and potentially broader than that. The primary difference here between this and the reports that you just saw is that one, you can watch kind of this funnel of users taking the adoption path from just, we've turned it on, have they come for the first time, and are they coming back? Two, you can use attributes like department or location that come from your Active Directory to see differences in different parts of the organization. That's probably one of the biggest advantages there. And you can build custom reports. That's a huge differentiator. So let me get you into what this looks like and how this works. So you start from the same usage reports I was showing you earlier. So you go into the usage reports, and on that home page, the main usage report page, my little circle moved, sorry, but there's a go to Power BI button down there. So this creates a set of reports in Power BI. And you want to take this tenant ID that you see in that panel and copy that before you move on to Power BI. You'd go to, if you haven't used it before, you'd go to Get Data in the bottom left, get your data from one of these services, and then you'll get, you want to select the Office 365 Adoption Preview Content Pack. And when you click Get It Now, it'll take a little while to churn and create the dashboard and the reports and populate it, but this is what you'll see. You'll land on this dashboard. This is too small for you to read, but this first entry here is the dashboard itself, which is what you're seeing. You get a broad overview of the different services. You can click a tile like SharePoint, for example, to go to a detailed report. You can then use filters that are on the right-hand side to filter these. So for example, for a given month, you can just filter it down to just one specific month to see what's happening then. And then, there are many reports across the bottom on these tabs. You may want to make an important point here, though, about viewing the data by department or location. So that is a key goal, and I'll tell a story about how it was used in a moment. But one thing to keep in mind is that it depends on having a clean Azure Active Directory. So your mileage may vary with this ability to filter. If you're like, unfortunately, Microsoft has pretty useless data in these two particular fields. Our departments are very convoluted, descriptions and so forth. So hopefully your Active Directory is very clean and crisp, and those provide a lot of value for you. Obviously, you can also create your own reports based on that data set. So if you clicked on data set here at the bottom, you get a nice blank sheet, and then you can just use the fields on the right to drag and drop. If you haven't used Power BI before, it's quite simple. Just drag and drop to create your own dashboards, like a report. Like, for example, this one is if one of our goals was we wanted to move our SharePoint sites from using the legacy team sites to the new Office 365 group sites, then you could create charts that show that progress. How much of our SharePoint platform is on the old team sites versus the new group sites. So as a simple example. Okay, let me provide you a story at this level. So here's a story that shows this is the kind of diagnosis and remediation you can do at the team or a function level within your organization. So the retail sales team of this large enterprise came to us and they said, look, we have a problem. We have some people who are posting to all company in Yammer, and although they were actually a little ambivalent at this point as to whether they wanted their employees using Yammer. They hadn't really got the picture yet of how that would work. But we definitely don't want them posting to all company because they may be posting, for example, they had seen some examples of people posting low stock inventory, right? And for this particular company, that would be a disaster if it leaked out, right, to the general public. So they didn't want them posting that broadly. So they came to us and said, could you help us with this? And because we already had access to the data, we were able to come to our first meeting with them and say, okay, yes, that is an issue. In fact, that issue is 3 times what you think it is, but there's an opportunity here. So what you didn't know before, do now, is that there are dozens of your retail employees that have set up private groups in Yammer, and they're private because you haven't given them a solid Yammer policy yet. So there's these private groups where they're doing all kinds of interesting things. And let me show you some of the interesting things that they're doing in there, right? Sharing display ideas and training each other and all these different things that they were doing that they had no visibility into because they were private groups. And so we could provide that to them to say, look, there's tons going on here. And this became a project, instead of a project about compliance, it became a story about a business opportunity and to how really to grow and transform their retail organization. So that's just, and that's still with some fairly high level data, but being able to scope it to, specific roles or function area of a company. Okay. So this last level this is where the real magic happens. And thanks in large part to partners like many of you who have put together, put our extensive APIs together with their imagination and their passion for driving business value. And so obviously the partner solutions will vary quite a bit, but the primary differentiator when you get to this level is both the breadth of data, so new kinds of things that they can measure or that they expose in their data and sets and reports, and the more data points that you have, you can incorporate. So you get more data points for the Microsoft services, but you can also incorporate your own data to increase the relevance even more. So you get also some thought leadership when it comes to helping you think about what that data means and what you can do to build stories of value with it. Okay. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit longer story in this case. So this is one of my former clients. So I just rejoined Microsoft actually after some brief time away with a company called Carpool Agency, and we had a client who was a real estate consultancy, and their top leadership deeply understood 2 things. One, they had a lot of valuable intellectual property in their staff, especially those with years of experience. Many of them had been with the company for 20 years. And some of them were starting to leave, and they were realizing just how much was walking out the door. So the second thing they realized is that they needed to capture it before it walked out the door. And that meant changing the way that they worked, and specifically how they shared their work. So they have been using Yammer for quite some time. And in fact, some industry benchmarking by some of our partners had showed that they're actually leaders in the way that they use it. But they weren't satisfied with that. They knew that they could get more value if everyone worked a bit more transparently. So they reached out to us. They reached out to Carpool Agency, and what we did was we helped them to make that shift. That was our goal. And so one of the first things we did was to use Swoop Analytics, which is one of the Microsoft partners in this space. And they what we did what we did with it was to score the top 10 leaders of the company on 9 specific sharing behaviors on that platform. And Swoop also told us what kind of persona each of those leaderships were operating in. So one of the things that Swoop does is that it looks at the data and it looks at an individual's data and classifies them into one of several different personas. So for example, if you're somebody who just posts there a lot and nobody really replies to what you're doing, then what you're sharing, then you're classified as a broadcaster. So I'm broadcasting a bunch of stuff, and kind of like this broadcast, nobody's able to reply in this case, but nobody does reply. So you wonder, in an environment where anybody can reply, what is the value of what they're providing, right? There might be another persona, which is an engager. That's where we really wanted them to be, which is you are doing a mix of both posting and replying and liking other people and making broad connections across the network. So we classified each of those leaders. So then what we did was, our next step was to interview all of the 10 major, highest level leaders in the company to find out who was talking the talk, even though they weren't walking the walk. And what those interviews did was they revealed some obstacles to sharing. Obstacles that, by the way, weren't limited to just Yammer. It was kind of how they were working culturally. So what we created was a coaching effort in a group that was set up just for the leadership of the company. And we coached them on how to overcome those obstacles. Now what we're doing is introducing a second partner, Tygraph. They have a product called Pulse that provides analytics across the Office 365 suite. Because again, this sharing behavior, although we wanted to see it used more effectively in Yammer, we wanted it to also bleed into all of the tools that they use across Office 365. Because of course, Yammer is great for communities, but the work was getting done in teams increasingly. And so we needed activity from more than just Yammer. So that's what Tygraph Pulse was for. And this chart obviously isn't their data, but you can see that they can use this to identify if their leaders are actually leading by example, right? So the results here are starting to show up now in both some subtle and some very concrete ways. So newer employees that we talked to said that this emphasis on the sharing culture really empowers them, makes them feel relevant, and they can see that they are part of a larger initiative in the company to capture this knowledge, and they can help actually to reverse mentor some of these leaders. They're adopting new ways of working. So I mentioned Microsoft Teams, and that is now being adopted as the default project space. This emphasis on watching how it is that we're behaving lets everybody know that, not in a big brother way, but they make it very explicit that we're going to, we're watching these numbers so that we can achieve this business goal of capturing as much knowledge as we can. And if we see that we're not capturing that knowledge, we're going to talk about that and try to address it and change keep correcting our behavior. Finally, probably most importantly for them, they actually won some of their largest contract ever recently. And one of the influencers that we had identified was the lead on that project. And so this leader is now using Teams for their communication. And what that does is then create a link between their success as a business and this culture shift that's being managed right now. So as you can see, I think what I hope you're seeing here is this linkage between there's the data. First of all, you have to enable the technology and align it with business purposes. Then you have the data that shows both where I can find opportunities to tell stories and to turn some dials, both from a behavioral, from a tools perspective, from a culture perspective, leadership, sponsorship, several different dials that you can determine there. And then you keep using that data to again tell the story of your success and what the transformation is looking like. Okay. So as we talk about this advanced level of advanced analytics, I do have to mention another offering from Microsoft in this space. So customers of workplace analytics, this is a new offering from Microsoft, are starting to tell some pretty powerful stories about how they're using data to shift their culture. So we have some real concrete evidence now showing that when sales staff, for example, when sales staff are more networked internally, they're also more effective sellers. We can show that multitasking during a meeting spreads like a virus. And so with this tool, you can start to, look at those behaviors as well, and put some interventions in place to, help raise the awareness of this, start changing behavior. There's lots of great stories and tips like this at insights.office.com, which talks about, the trends that we see in productivity in the workplace. All right. So to kind of wrap up, I've seen organizations move from passive complacency about work habits to a really passionate quest for increased productivity. And what the key is, it happens when you focus on why you're adopting the tools or making those changes, and then using data from those tools and conversations with your employees to tell a story. It's a story about the impact that reducing meeting time or being more transparent or crowdsourcing innovation has on the people that are your biggest asset as a company. So I've used a photo of mine as a background here because it represents my own story, right? I've recently been able to move to my wife's native Scotland. And this move, which is the attainment of a 25-year dream for us as a couple, can be traced directly to my embrace of new ways of working and using data to show others the power of doing the same. I've been able to do this. You can, what you can do by embracing new ways of working, either as an individual or as a team, will differ from my story, of course. But the point is, I have a story about that. And finding and telling those stories of value and opportunity and impact is one of the most important things you can do with this data. So there are a lot of partners. I've mentioned a few along the way that can help you with the journey. And I'm speaking to partners just as much as to other kinds of partners, as much as I am speaking to customers here. What we often see work really well is that if you are a partner who is focused on, who has a real core competency in activating, deploying and activating Microsoft technology, that's great. Keep that competency. We absolutely need those. But maybe you can either develop those competencies around adoption internally, or you can partner with some of these others to go together to our customers to make these things real. So we've got partners of lots of types. I was with Carpool Agency, which is what we would call an adoption specialist or an adoption focused partner. There are tool vendors that I worked with, such as Swoop and Tygraph that I mentioned before. And others, there are hardware companies even like Plantronics, who partner with Cloud Assist to build some telemetry that shows how the gadgets that we use at work can interact with the services, and what is that interaction that happens there, and how does that play into adoption. You can talk to your Microsoft account manager about what partners could help you with your efforts to take better advantage of the data in driving business value through better adoption of those tools that you may already own as a customer. So that is what I have in terms of presentation for today. I love that we have a few minutes here for Q&A, and so an internal list here to see what the questions are. So question, I have Power BI Pro, therefore I can access the adoption dashboard that has been shared with me by the global admin. How do I share the dashboard to people with just the Power BI free license? So the good news is you can always capture those in a screenshot and send them in a PowerPoint presentation. Sharing is actually one of the key differentiators between Power BI Free and Power BI Pro. So if you have that need to share those dashboards out with others, then you can Then you can get licenses for those who need to actually share and manipulate those reports. If you just need to expose a chart somewhere, then of course you can use the embed functionalities to embed a specific report into a SharePoint site, for example. So another question, in your customer success work, what examples of success have you seen in customers beyond more adoption percentages and numbers of licenses? Examples of success have you seen in your customers? Okay, so let me give you a great example. One of my favorites is, some of the stories that I've talked about, it's probably been a little bit subtle what they have gotten out of it, other than more numbers. Starting with one of the first stories I talked about, what they eventually, so this was the internal communications one, and the KPIs, the business KPIs that were tied to that were internal employee satisfaction surveys, right? So they had a survey where they're surveying employees on a regular basis to find out how connected they feel. And they actually are starting to track that against the uptake of these communications platforms. So in other words, they're trying to draw a connection between, as people engage more on these platforms for internal communication collaboration, does their satisfaction with being an employee in our division actually tick up? And they're starting to see some changes around morale, for example. But I think one of the most powerful stories I have around that is Sanofi Pasteur, a French pharmaceutical. They launched an innovation program, and by focusing on the adoption of Yammer in that case, for that specific business purpose of saving the company money saving ideas and other kinds of innovations, they were able to make a serious business impact, and they can measure it to the tune of hundreds of thousands of euros on innovative processes that came out of that kind of adoption. Okay, let me try and get to another one here. Does Workplace Analytics tap into the data that individuals receive as My Analytics? Yes, in fact. So My Analytics is just my personal view. Insights.office.com is where you can find more information about it. But My Analytics is my personal view on my own interactions through Exchange. Workplace Analytics is the organizational view of that. So two different products, and My Analytics generally much more available, but as a personal view. Okay. Do you have any tips or tricks or traps on managing adoption issues within customer IT departments versus user communities? So I don't think the most important factor in driving adoption, really, even though I've spent this whole time talking about analytics, they're really actually in service of something else, which is the importance of the business goal for that scenario. So what I find is that it doesn't make any difference whether it's an IT department or a user community. The primary gating factor is whether there is sponsorship, whether they are able to effectively manage their communities, and I think that these analytics that I've been talking about are a big piece of that. They're a piece of being able to tell a story across all of these factors, but whether they actually have change management in place, and whether they're, of course, communicating about it. So I would say that, I guess I would say it doesn't really. There may be some subtle differences. They're not nearly as important as the other things that I've talked about. In your experience, how do Yammer admins and community managers, how do convince their organization to invest in a more advanced platform like Swoop or tyGraph? I think that boils down once again to the importance of the overall scenario. So if it was just, so let me go back to the internal communications example that I started with towards the beginning. They already had tyGraph in that case in place. when we started with them, so it wasn't a decision. You know, they already had access to the data, so I didn't have to make that case. If it hadn't been in place, would I have been able to convince them to to spend money on an analytics solution for an internal communication scenario? Maybe. Depends on how critical the HR situation that started that whole project was for them, and whether we could make that business case. Maybe. But if it's this innovation scenario, for example, that I described at Sanofi Pasteur, there is often line of sight to the CFO and others as to just how important moving the needle on innovations and whatnot is. And so it's kind of a two-step, two steps removed, perhaps, or one step removed. So you have to have the critical business goal where it is known how important landing that business metric is. Then you say, okay, we're going to address that through engagement on these platforms, whether that's Microsoft Teams or SharePoint or Yammer, or whatever it is, right? So what's the solution? Then you can more easily make the case that we need more than just how many people have visited the site. We need a deeper level of knowledge on that, and we need to invest maybe not just in analytics tools, but also in some maybe some consultants to come in and say, do some interviews and get the real story behind those numbers, and help us to find the stories of real impact that we can then play back to the rest of the organization to drive even broader and better adoption. So that's what I've heard there. Let me look back here and see if I've missed any. Okay, question here. In your experience, are the tracked success metrics built with business decision maker input? Are the tracked success metrics? So they better be. I have to put this. So I spent before this role as a customer success manager in Microsoft, I was in Microsoft IT as well. And I think one of the most important lessons I learned in watching Microsoft's own IT department transform over the last, 6-7 years that I've been involved with them, is an understanding of how your value changes as an IT person, right? So you really need to become not the person who's running servers and not seen that way, but the person who is adding business value and connecting business value to the tools that are being provided, in some cases by companies like Microsoft or whatever. So in other words, if you elevate yourself to a business analyst role in some respects, or however you want to call it, you're doing more translation of business value. And I think this space of analytics on the productivity tools becomes an all the more critical arrow in your quiver, if you will, for having those conversations. So with the business decision maker. So you go to your business decision maker and say, hey, I need to know what are the business goals you're trying to achieve with these tools, and then I have the data. I have not only do I have the tools, I have the data and everything to make you a rock star and prove that you can achieve those business goals by changing some behavior and investing in that change. So I think that's about it for today. Thank you very much for taking the time out to show up. I would love to engage with you more. Let me see if I've got did I get my contact information in there? I did. So you can find me both on Twitter and on LinkedIn. Love to talk with you about this more. It's a passion of mine, why I agreed to do the seminar. So please reach out, and thank you again.
All right, thank you, Chris. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take a moment and bring your attention to a link in the upper right-hand corner of your video pane that says, please take a short survey. That's a link to a short survey for this web conference, and we ask that you please take a moment before logging out to access it. We hope that you found today's information helpful, and if you enjoyed today's web conference, have feedback on how we can provide you with a better event, or you would like to submit topics for future web conferences, this is your chance to let us know. The survey scores are on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible. And that is going to conclude today's web conference. The recording from today's presentation will be available within 5 business days. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenter, Chris, and thank you, audience, for logging in and joining us today.